I have been working with Derwent Inktense for over a decade now, and it is one of my favorite materials to work with, and a lot of you seem to like it when I work with Inktense on the channel, and I'm always getting a ton of questions on the channel about Inktense, so I thought that it would be fun for me to answer some of your questions today, so that's what we're gonna do. Hi, Shanna Rowe Jackson here from Caution Artists at Play. I recently put out a community post asking you if you had any questions about Derwent Inktense. Derwent Inktense seems to be a very popular subject on my channel, and I'm always getting a ton of questions about how I work with them and the different properties of Inktense, and so I thought it would be fun to answer your questions today. Now, this video is not sponsored by Derwent. They have no affiliation with this video. This just happens to be one of my favorite mediums, and I've worked with it for a very long time. So I'm going to use my experience and the research I've done over the years to help answer your questions to the best of my ability. Everybody works with these a little bit differently, so if you work with Inktense differently than I do, that's perfectly fine. I will be referencing some of the Derwent website frequently asked questions, and I will also be answering your questions based on how I personally work with Derwent Inktense. I will have a drawing going in the background of some blueberries from my backyard, but this is not a step-by-step tutorial. It's really more of an overview and just kind of getting to know what you're looking for in Inktense and trying to help you out a little bit. So let's just get down to it. Okay, so before I get to the questions from the community post, let's talk about Inktense. What is Inktense? And the biggest question and debate that comes up in my comments is whether or not it's actually ink. So I'm going to reference the Derwent frequently asked questions. And there is a question there that says, is Derwent Inktense classed as an ink or a watercolor product? And Derwent's official answer is, it is classed as a watercolor product, but it has different properties to a regular watercolor pencil, making it look like an ink. So essentially, this is a watercolor pencil that is formulated to be a little bit more rugged, a little bit more vibrant, and to look more like an ink. Now, I was also under the impression for many years that these were legitimately ink in a pencil. I think that's how they were advertised when they first came out. Don't quote me on that. But even in my older videos, you'll hear me reference them as an ink. And I had a viewer one time comment and be like, they're not actually an ink. And that's when I did my research, and that's when I found it on the Derwent website. Is it an ink? Is it a watercolor? I'm not concerned because I love working with them either way. But now in my recent videos, you do hear me reference them as a water-soluble colored pencil, which it is, whether it's an ink or not, it's a water-soluble colored pencil because it basically just means it's a colored pencil that can be washed out with water. So that's why you hear me refer to it the way I do now. But if you look at my old videos, you're going to hear it the other way. And then when asked how they would describe the Derwent Inktense products, they say Inktense is a pigment-based product that is extremely soluble in water, but it has a transparent ink-like wash. Unlike a traditional watercolor, Inktense is also permanent when dry. And so we're going to talk about some of these aspects of Inktense with some of your questions, because it will address some of these claims to fame, because they do advertise them as being permanent and they advertise them as being ink-like and all these different things. But it really kind of depends on how you're working with them in order to get those properties to shine through to the best of the Inktense ability, so to speak. So let's get down to your questions. LJ1980 asks, for someone who hasn't used them much, how would you choose between the pencils, blocks, and paint pans? And for that, I would say it depends on where you are in your artistic journey. If you're somebody who comes from a watercolor background, then you may want to ease your way into the Inktense line by using the pans or even the blocks. If you're somebody who comes from a colored pencil background, then I would say start with the pencils. I started with the pencils because at the time I was working really heavily with colored pencil, and then I just wanted to explore different kinds of pencils, and that's how I ended up getting these. I do feel like the pencils are the most versatile, but I don't know if that's just because I have a preference towards pencils to begin with, although I have been really into watercolor lately as well. They are all extremely versatile though, so it just depends on where your starting point is. I feel like they're easier to learn if you already have experience with other materials. So if you have experience with watercolors, you might want to start with the pans and work from there, and maybe buy like a few pencils to do details on top if you're leaning that way. And if you start with pencils, like if you do colored pencil, I would definitely start with the pencils. But it really just comes down to personal preference and what you think you will use the most, what kind of artist you are, what kind of supplies interest you the most. But they're all extremely versatile. You can get a whole myriad of effects from each of these products, especially because they're so easy to layer. Krista asks, if someone wanted to buy 24 of the pencils open stock, which colors would you consider essential for a variety of subjects? Or is it better to just go with the sets they offer? I'd love to hear about your favorite colors or most useful colors in the video. So I have to say, I did start with the 24 set, I believe. I think they have a 12 set as well, but I started with the 24 and I used that for a very long time before I finally upgraded. And it did pretty much everything I needed to do. Because these are so highly mixable, you really don't need a lot of colors. Now, if you already have experience with them, so you know that you like them. So I would probably just start with a regular 24 set, but some of my favorite colors, like for people who are very new to this medium, who haven't tried them before, if they want to try a few open stock, I gotta say, I really love the bright blue, the fuchsia, and the sun yellow for my primaries. That's a good starting point so that you can mix any color that you really need and then maybe add the ink black to it. And I actually have a video on that where I'm using the primaries. You can get pretty much any color you need with those 3 colors because they're essentially a primary set. They do offer some 6 sets and some 12 sets that I think are pretty good as well. But I think that starting back into it, the 24 set is really all you would need. Some of my favorite colors just like on the side, I don't even know if they're in the 24 set or not. I really love the sherbet lemon. I really love the leaf and light olive colors because I'm a green girl, so I use a lot of greens in my artwork. But it really depends on what you are creating, but I don't think you can really go wrong with that 24 set just because of how highly mixable they are. Becky asks, I tend to go in slapdash mainly because my color theory is poor. Do you have some tips and tricks on how to use the pencils and blocks for a complete noob? My main thing is, I think it's good that you're going in and just playing around, because that's going to be the quickest way that you learn how to use these. I can give you all the tips and tricks that I know, but until you get the feel for the pencils in your hands or you get the feel for the blocks and until you're using them consistently, you're not necessarily going to understand what I'm getting at. So my advice to you is to just play around with them and don't think about it too much. I've been using Inktense since before I was on YouTube, and I didn't even know that Art YouTube was a thing. So everything that I have learned about Inktense, I taught myself just by using them and using them a lot. So that's going to be your quickest way. Then some of the things that you see in my tutorials might click and make more sense. But the best way to do it is to have the supplies in hand and using them. So take out some scrap paper that doesn't cost a lot, play around with some things, get used to color mixing. I think it actually helps to have very few colors. If you get a smaller set of Inktense instead of starting with a larger set, it forces you to mix color and you learn a lot quicker that way. So I definitely recommend starting off with like the 12 set or the 24 set for that reason. And that will help you get used to color mixing as well, because if you don't have so many colors to choose from, you're forced to learn how to make them yourself. So that will help you with color theory quite a bit. But also download a cheap color wheel or get one from an art store. They're fairly inexpensive, and that will help you learn color theory as well, because it'll show you what colors to mix with what to get the color that you're looking for. You can also use color pickers online or in your photo editing program if you're working from a photo, and use a color picker and pinpoint a color that you're a little confused on. It'll isolate it and give you a better idea of what color you're actually seeing as opposed to what color you think you're seeing. That also helps with color mixing. But as far as the Inktense or any supply goes, use it, use it, use it, use it, and that's how you're going to learn all the different properties and how they handle. That's how you're going to get used to the amount of pigment you need on the paper, the amount of water you need on the paper. And it's okay to make some ugly art. What you're seeing on my channel for Inktense is, again, this is artwork that I've been working with these materials for a decade now. So it's going to be a little bit different. And so definitely just play around with them, try them out, and you know, when you hear of a new technique, try it on a scrap piece of paper first instead of a piece that you're really invested in. So if it doesn't go right, you're not screwing up a piece and feeling like you have to start over. So just play. Fluorite Fox asks how to use the blocks. Also, I noticed the blocks dry quite chalky. That's why I prefer the pencils. So there's a lot of different ways to use the blocks. I tend to use them like watercolor pans. I had the blocks before the watercolor pans actually came out. And so what I do is I take my wet brush, swipe it across the block, and paint it on. And I often use them as an underpainting for my Inktense pencil work because it helps to cover large areas faster. Now, I have also noticed the chalkiness, and I think that it's worse when you don't wash them out enough. If there's too much binder still sticking around, they do tend to be a little bit chalkier. So I like to build my blocks up in light layers. And I do the same with all of them, actually, the pencils, the blocks, the pans. However, Derwent does note on their website that the binders in the blocks are slightly different than the binders in the pencils. And so I think that's where some of the chalkiness is coming from as well. So I like to use them most often as a way to create an underpainting, fill large areas quickly, but they are still quite versatile and you can use them in a lot of other ways as well. And I do have a video about that. I think I linked that in the response to your question on my post, but I will link it again in the description below in case anybody else is curious. I have a video about using Derwent Inktense blocks and how to create texture with them. You might find that helpful as well because I go through all the different ways that I use the blocks in that video. Bassman60 asks, I'd love to see how to blend with them. Now, Derwent Inktense is a very versatile medium, and there's multiple ways to blend them because you have the best of both worlds between the colored pencil aspect and the watercolor aspect. I do have a video with my 6 favorite ways to use Derwent Inktense pencils, and I talk a lot about the different ways that I mix them in that video. If you haven't seen it, I will link it in the description below. But basically, my favorite ways are the palette method, which is where I take the pencils, scratch them onto a palette, and mix them with water on the palette, and then bring them over and paint them on like a watercolor. I also like to use transparent glazes to create optical mixes by layering one color over another and letting the other layer show through. Once my color is dry, if I want to change it up a little bit, I will take a different color and glaze it over it with a lot of water, and one color will show through that glaze and they'll kind of optically mix together to create a new color. And so you're going to see that a lot with these blueberries. Once I get to the blue blueberries, you're going to see me glaze some purple over it to make the blueberries a little bit more on the blue violet side as opposed to just blue. So that's another way that I like to mix colors. And then of course, there is mixing directly on the paper. And that leads us into the next question by Galactic Pirates. I know you use the scratch palette method a lot, but do you ever color a picture and then activate the Inktense pencils? I really struggle with getting the right amount of pigment down. Any tips? So my biggest tip for this one is to make sure you're not using too much pigment too fast, because that can cause a lot of issues with mixing. As you can see here, I work light to dark, thinner layers to thicker layers. I find that with the pencils, it can be really easy to overdo it. A little goes a long way with Derwent Inktense. It's a little bit opposite to regular colored pencil, whereas with regular colored pencil, you want to try to fill as much of the tooth of the paper as possible before you bring in your odorless mineral spirits to blend it out. Otherwise, you can get kind of a grainy texture that just kind of stays there. But with Inktense, it's the opposite. If you have too much pencil down too fast, it can be more difficult to blend out because it feels to me like pushing around wet clay with your brush. And so you can get a lot of streaks that way. So my biggest advice is to use light pencil strokes when you're first starting out, and then continue to layer as you go and build up your saturation that way. Because otherwise you're going to get some kind of clumpiness feeling with the binder. Really, it comes down to having too much binder on the paper. It can make it difficult to get smoother mixtures that way. So thinner layers to thicker layers, and then come on top with your pencils to get those really dark darks. If you do have a lot of pencil on your paper and you have already kind of filled the tooth of the paper with your dry pencil, then use less water. Because if you come in with a lot of water on a lot of pigment, you're gonna get a mess. So really dab off your paintbrush, just come in with a damp brush and use really, really small strokes to kind of fill in those little areas that you need blended out, because if you come in with a lot of water, it's going to push the pigment away from the water and you're going to get these big gaps and blooms, and you're going to get these little areas of pigment that build up. So you get like really strong areas of pigment that can be harder to wash away. So that's my main advice there. Don't go too heavy-handed with your pencils right off the bat. Use light layers and more water in the beginning. And if you do have a lot of pencil on the paper already, go in with very little water and light brush strokes to blend it out. Art by Me R1F asks, I'm always a bit struggling with mixing the right colors. I know you draw a lot of landscapes, and you know I usually do portraits, but how would you mix skin color with Inktense? So I did used to do portraits a lot more back when I was first using Inktense. And there are no pencils in the Inktense line that are specifically made for skin tones. And so it does require some mixing. And as I mentioned before, I started with the 24 set. So the colors that I used to use the most to mix just a baseline for a Caucasian skin tone is Baked Earth and Fuchsia. I used to do some mixtures with those two colors, and then I would bring in Mustard or Sun Yellow to lean more towards the olive side of a skin tone, and Willow to darken things a bit. Some other colors that you might want to use if you're creating darker skin tones, Madder Brown as like just a starting point maybe. I don't think that one's in the 24 set though, and I think that Bark is in the 24 set, and that one's for like darker shadows. But again, you're going to want to look at the people that you're drawing and really figure out what their underlying skin tones are. Now, I almost always use the palette method for skin tones because the colors in these sets aren't specifically necessarily skin tone colors, and they come off really strong, especially when you're working with the pencils. The pencils are really vibrant and rugged right out the gate, dry without adding water. So I always use the palette method, and I scratch my colors on the side and mix it that way. And then I build up my skin tones from light to dark. I just build and build and build. I put on a layer, I let it dry, I come back on with another layer. And again, these colors that I showed you, these are just my starting point. You want to look at the overall skin tone of the individual, and you also want to pay attention to lighting because you might need to bring in some blues or some purples or even some greens. I know green is a great underpainting for Caucasian skin tone, so sometimes I go in with my olive green and do an underpainting with shadows for skin tones before I come on top with the mixture that I just showed you. So play around on your palette, play with these colors and see if they work, and play with all your other earth tones, your other browns that you have on hand, and see if that works as well. But generally speaking, if you have some sort of brown with a little bit of a red, or I prefer magenta, like a pink or something like that, and you bring in not necessarily a stark yellow, and you don't want a whole lot of yellow, but just a little bit of that, you can pretty much mix all the skin tones that you need. And again, bring in some violets and blues and greens depending on your lighting and the undertone of the skin that you are working on. Donna asks, I've heard how they perform like a permanent ink and don't reactivate once dried. I haven't had much luck with that. Any suggestions? Thanks. The biggest tip that Derwent gives out, and the biggest tip that I give out, is to make sure you are washing your colors out completely. It is mainly the binder that is water soluble. So if you wash it out completely, you don't have as much of that binder anymore, and it allows the pigments to sink into the paper. My working theory, and again, it's just a theory, I don't know what pigments Derwent uses, but my theory is they use highly staining pigments. And in order for those pigments to stain, they need to be able to sink into the paper. So that means they need more water. Let it sink into the paper and let it dry really well before you decide to glaze over it. And it's much easier when you do it with thin layers. Now, the fact that it doesn't get permanent until you do that is actually a plus side, because that gives you time. If it's not completely dry, you can still lift out mistakes. And if you haven't washed out the binder completely and you don't really like the spot, then you can wash it out and fix it that way. So it does kind of have a plus side. However, if you're looking for optimal permanency, wash it out completely, get rid of that binder, let it sink into the paper, let it dry before you layer on top, and it works a lot better that way. My last question comes from Wildflower1397. I have concerns about lightfastness. I have heard the more you wash them out, the faster they fade. Does this ring true? So, to a degree, yes, it does ring true, as it does with every other watercolor medium out there. That is kind of how it goes when you are using a water-soluble medium. When you use a lot of water with something, you're doing away with some of the protective binders, and so there's not as much protection from the light. So if you're working with something like an acrylic or an oil where you're not using as much water and you're not washing it out as much, then you have that protective binder. Those binders are really kind of staying in place. Acrylic and oil kind of have stronger binders to begin with. But with things like regular watercolors and with watercolor pencils, it is a little bit different because they're made to be washed out. And that's also dispersing the pigment particles further away from one another, and that allows for more light to get in around them. Now, that's why it's very important to pay close attention to your Lightfast ratings, because if you have a pigment that is good for 100 years or more, you're going to get a lot less of that fading. But if you have a fugitive color that is only good for, like, say 5 years, you're going to see that fading a lot faster once you have added water. But this is the case with all watercolors. They're known to be less light fast than some of the other media out there. That's why I think it's very important to use the highest light fastness that you can. And Derwent Inktense has a lot of light fast colors. None of my pieces have ever faded. I don't tend to use anything less than a 6 in my work, and I still have plenty of pencils to work with. So I think when you have a pigment that is highly light fast to begin with, it's going to give you the most chances that you have, and you're not really probably going to see much of that shift in your lifetime, even if you have added some water to it. But if you, again, are using a fugitive color, you're going to see that shift a lot faster once you add water. I think because Derwent has been honest about the fact that they hadn't tested their water-soluble media after it's been washed out, people think that that automatically means that they're not as stable. Derwent goes according to the pigments that they have. These pigments are likely the same pigments that you're seeing Daniel Smith use, that you're seeing Core use, that you're seeing Holbein use. There's only a certain amount of pigments out there in the world that these art manufacturers are using. So if they're saying that their pencil is rated an 8, which is rated for a 1 on the ASTM scale, it's highly light fast, it is good for 100 years, they're going according to their pigments, and it's no different than using a watercolor that has those same pigments. I do wish that Derwent would release their pigment information. It might be a little bit more helpful. However, most pencil manufacturers, whether it's a regular colored pencil or not, other than the exception of Caran d'Ache with their museum aquarelle, they don't release their pigment information. If you plan on selling your work, just like with watercolor, use your highest light fast pencils available. Keep them out of sunlight, use a UV spray or a UV glass in your frame. But that's all any of us really can do when we're working with any product, any art product, and we're going according to the light fastness of the pigment. So that's it as far as the questions from the community tab go. Thank you for submitting your questions. I hope that my answers were helpful. All right, friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found it helpful. I will link the resources and materials in the description below. I will also be doing more Inktense content in the future, so if you have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comments section. I will see you next time. You have a fantastic day. Bye.